If you're passionate about classical education and you're looking for the next step, Hillsdale College's Diana Davis Spencer Graduate School of Classical Education is now offering 2 master's degree programs. These programs provide students with a broad philosophical, historical, literary, and pedagogical perspective on classical education. The Master of Arts in Classical Education is a 2-year, in-person program on Hillsdale's campus in Michigan, while the Master of Classical Education Leadership is a 3-year hybrid program with a 1-week summer class held at Hillsdale College. Whether you're interested in teaching, administration, or another area within the field of classical education, we're prepared to offer you a foundational, time-proven approach to your studies. We want to see your application soon. Applications must be submitted on or before December 15th, 2024 for full consideration. To learn more and submit your application, visit classicalgrad.hillsdale.edu. That's classicalgrad.hillsdale.edu.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scot Bertram.
Thanks for listening. The Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast is part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. You also can find more information on topics and ideas discussed on this show at our website, k12.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by Nate Neveau. He is Athletic Director at Hillsdale Academy here in Hillsdale, Michigan. Nate, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Talking today about classical physical education for modern times. Before we do, tell us a little bit about what you do as Athletic Director at Hillsdale Academy.
Yeah, so my main responsibility as athletic director is to oversee all of our athletic programs, but because we see athletics as part of the education and a large part of athletics involves the physical, that also includes some work with our physical education classes. And so I work a little bit with them, with our athletics, and then I also have some other kind of operational admin roles in the school, as well as I teach an upper school class, so coach as well. So a lot of hats, a lot of different ways to be involved in the school, which I really enjoy.
Yeah. All right. So how would you define classical physical education?
Yeah, I think the important place to start when we're talking about classical physical education is with the robust view of man that I think is consistent throughout the classical tradition. And I think we have to understand that in classical physical education, we are educating through the physical, which is primarily an education of the body, but it is not disconnected from the education of the soul, spirit, heart, however you want to define or describe that part of man, and also the mind. And so man, there's a harmony in man between the different parts of him, and that the education, the physical education, the education of the body also informs those parts of man. And so physical education primarily focuses on the body, but has a connection with the education of the whole.
How does physical education fit within the whole of a classical education?
Yeah, so if you look at prominent classical sources, just to name one, the Republic of Plato, when he's talking about guardian education, the education of the body, gymnastics, is actually education from the beginning, and that's done with music. And there's a sort of harmony that comes between this poetry and music, and then the vigor that comes through physical exercise, gymnastics. And I think that view of education remains, where there's this kind of necessary cultivation of the body towards excellence, but also the spirit and the mind, and that builds from kind of foundations up. And where there is harmony, there's health.
What constitutes the content of a classical physical education? What's in the curriculum?
Yeah, so it's not necessarily there are certain prescriptives, but to say it's this game or this game, I think is too specific. But I do think that there are core elements that are going to be part of any physical education program. And interestingly, sometimes I think classical education may identify points and rightly to distinguish itself from a different type of education. But sometimes basketball is basketball. It doesn't matter if you're at a classical school or not. And so the content sometimes may look similar. There's other parts or ways in which it may not. But the content sometimes looks similar to games that are played, movements that are developed. But I think there's a couple key components that go into every class and that fill out the curriculum. I think the first is an emphasis on just general fitness. And this includes starting with movement, proper movement, mobility, flexibility, and building towards strength and elegance. And so there's just the kind of an underlying base of fitness that is aimed at with the activities. We want our kids moving. An example that I've talked about with others, games that are fun, but maybe that don't evoke as much activity, may not be games for a classical education, physical education class, because we really want every class to have an element of fitness in it. And so fitness is a core part of every activity. I think that there is also an element of joy that is to be brought out in what is taught. This comes through games. It does come through even learning various exercises and improving them progress through types of movements, things that build on one another, and students mastering that and improving in that and finding joy in that. But we do really want joy to be a part of the content. And then finally, I think another key element is skill that enables further activity. And whether that's in something that will be a sport later on, or that's something that will be a skill that can serve them in being active throughout their lives. Those development of those that provide opportunities to stay active and healthy are really important. I think coming back again to philosophy of physical education in a classical school, we are looking to cultivate healthy students, but also set the foundation for healthy lives. And so when we're doing a unit, for example, a sports unit in a physical education class, we're not merely trying to support an athletic program at a school, but we're trying to teach skills that is going to enable a student to be active in this way for his or her life for a long time. And so some of the language we use around the philosophy of that is a healthy student, but also a view towards the potential adult. We want a view towards the potential of adult that's going to be healthy, flourishing physically, as well as in heart and mind.
Does the concept idea of competition enter the classical physical education classroom, whether that be competition with others or competition internally, improving, getting better? Yeah,
absolutely. I think that there's this competition puts us kind of in a moment that can evoke the best in us and may also evoke the worst in us. And I think it's some of those moments that we actually grow the most. And so I think there's something wonderful about competition. And one of the important things is that you have an instructor, you have teachers that can guide students through that. When they compete and it turns into a pushing match between two fifth grade boys because they disagreed on a call, there's actually something incredible to learn in that, something to learn about justice, humility, cooperation that sometimes is not taught as well without the experience of it. And so there really is, I think, through competition, an opportunity to teach virtue, which is something that we ultimately want to teach in our schools. But I do think that there is, as you mentioned, kind of two types of competition. There's this competition against others, and then also a competition against self. And I think that those are two powerful ways to go about competition. One of the ways that's done in a physical education class is maybe some testing or measuring of certain performance, say push-ups or mile run, and then some movement, activity, hard work, and participation throughout a class, and then measure again. And students that are active, that put the work in, when they see success, they have this opportunity to compete against themselves and improve, that teaches and reinforces that the work that I put in was worth it, and that it did lead to improvement. Sometimes you put in work and it doesn't too, and there's something to learn there. And so that internal competition is very powerful. But I do think, sometimes I think competition can get a little bit of a dirty name. Not always. But I do think healthy competition between classmates, or when you get to sport, competing against another school possibly, I think that there can be something really healthy in that, with the right people guiding and teaching through it.
How would you compare or contrast the concept of improvement and achievement in the classroom with the concept of improvement and achievement in physical education?
They're very similar paths or arcs. Often you start somewhere, and ideally you want to improve, and there's some type of work that needs to go into improving, and then just move to a classroom for a second, an academic classroom. You're going to say you're trying to learn how to spell certain words, or even read, something like that. There's kind of a level that you're at. You are at that level, you receive instruction, you struggle through the struggle with guidance, improve, reach another level. That same kind of path is followed physically. In the classroom, there's kind of this natural development of the mind that's happening. That's also happening with the body. And so in the same way that in the classroom, we really do want to see kind of a progression with natural development of what should be cultivated intellectually and kind of in the soul, we want to see that with the body as well in physical education. And so, an attention and a serious thoughtfulness to what that looks like with a given age. What is appropriate content for a second grader is very different than what's an appropriate content for a 12th grader. And a lot of classical schools, not all, but a lot of them are K-12 on the same campus, oftentimes with teachers teaching the full spectrum of grades. And so it requires a thoughtful teacher that's intentional and sees the whole and how the student grows through it.
Talking with Nate Neveau, who is athletic director at Hillsdale Academy, about classical physical education for modern times. Does there need to be adjustments, changes in content or approach for the modern times? Yeah,
I think the qualifier or question, so what does this mean for our time? Our classical roots often go back to ancient Greece. I referenced Plato earlier, and I think a question is, do we just repeat the type of education that was done for the young men at that time? Are we doing a Persian or a Spartan education, training for military battle? Are we training our great Olympian athletes? Like what exactly are we doing? And I think there's things that actually be learned from all of those approaches of the past. But we find ourselves in a particular context. I think one maybe way to think about this is that we have a cultural inheritance. And in some ways we are recipients of that, and we're also extenders of that. And so to learn the language of the games that are American is actually really important for a student to be able to participate in a conversation and understand the place of sport, leisure, or competitive in American life. And knowing what baseball is, or what, even though it's really hard to teach probably in a PE class, or knowing what basketball or football is. Those are good things to know as Americans. I think there's also there could be a tendency to say, we're classical, we're going back to the roots, we need to get on horses and joust, we need to do a Greek phalanx battle. And if you can pull that off and do it well, like, it could be great. Might have some legal things to deal with, but it could be good. But classical physical education doesn't have to be that to be classical. I think that the real distinctive for classical physical education is the understanding of who man is, what we are educating towards and how the physical connects to that. And so there's a real art for the teacher to ensure that just playing a game isn't just kind of play, though it is, but that there is a purpose, intention, and then there's an art of guiding a student through that for something that's important. I do also think that there's something about our current time, whether we want to call this the modern times in a broader sense or our current time, that is challenging to physicality. There's writings, I think President Kennedy in the 60s, in 1960 released an article concerned about American fitness because of the number, about 50% of the population was not physically fit for World War II. 50% of eligible draftees were not fit. In response to that and some of the programs that developed, there's statements of concerns in the 60s. One program is the La Sierras program, which is recommended. Parts of it are recommended in the Hillsdale K-12 program guide. There's statements in that manual that point to concerns, including increased time and spectator activity in front of the television and the lack of mobility due to the automobile. And this is in the 1960s. And there seems to be, and not to say this is all bad, but it is something we have to reconcile with the desire to be healthy and fit. There does seem to be a kind of trend technologically to reduce the need of physical labor for daily work. It's convenient, it's efficient, and it is those things, and it's helpful in some ways, but that does impact the physical exertion we need to do those. And so recognizing that's a situation we live in, how do we remain healthy? How do we remain strong? How do we fight against that kind of tendency to be sedentary? And so I think that is something. Yes, we have to recognize with our students, but we also have to set our students up to go into a world where that is maybe more of the norm than it was 100 years ago. And we want them to live healthy, flourishing lives, not just when they're 18, but when they're 30 and 40. And so I think that our view of physical education in the modern times has to have that in mind.
For our physical education teachers, what are some important methods, practices that should be incorporated into the physical education classroom?
Yeah, so I think, that reflecting on my own experience, thinking about other students, for some, not all, but for some, this is an exciting time of the day. They get to come, they get to run around, they get to be active. Our kids at Hillsdale Academy especially the younger ones, get recess, PE 2 times a week with a kind of a third swimming unit. But they cherish these moments. They want to move. And I think that one of the best things a teacher can do to make sure that that time is orderly and productive and not just chaotic energy is to start class really well. And so the procedure and the way in which students are received and then intentionally directed into productive activity that is not militant but joyful. How do we get them moving and engaged right away in an orderly way with expectations that are met and kept? And then I think there's a couple different kind of ways to set a lesson, but I think one of the best that I've seen and that our teachers will do is, so we have this kind of procedure for starting class. Our kids change. They come in their uniforms. They go change into their PE uniforms. They come in class. They have something to kind of keep them active and engaged while the rest are changing. And then when everyone's there, they start with a kind of a prescripted warm-up routine that they know. And so that the tone is set really well. It's serious. We know what we're doing. You can even get there. It takes maybe a little bit longer with the young ones, but you get there. And so you have that really good start. And then from there, you can build into, okay, today is, we're going to be playing Capture the Flag or something like that. Or today is going to be a test day. But you have kind of these markers and expectations. And then similarly, and this is maybe This is maybe more for the teachers that are receiving the student on the back end, but you got to finish well. If you kind of you don't wrap things up, you don't kind of have a final word with the students, they change and they sprint back to their classroom and they're still arguing about the game and the calls that were made. You might waste 20 minutes of the teacher's class time because he or she has to arbitrate that.
Now they're a referee.
Yeah, yep, that's right. So I think it's really important for a teacher to start and end well and thoughtfully. I think that really helps the class.
Final question for Nate Neveau here. How should classical schools approach that relationship between physical education and sport? You talked earlier about knowing football, baseball, basketball. It's part of, in many ways, being an American, I suppose. How do you approach that relationship?
Yeah, it's challenging, and it's hard to give an absolute, here is what every school needs to do. I'll talk a little bit about our situation at Hillsdale Academy. We're fortunate to have a pretty strong athletic program in addition to our PE program. And one of the things that we have to think about, and one of the things we believe, is that while athletics is extracurricular, it is we are pushing absolutely in the same direction as everything else we're doing at the school. We're seeking to cultivate virtue and wisdom in our students, and we believe that competitive athletics is a training ground to do that. And so we have in our high school, over 90% of our kids are doing at least one sport. And so they're active through that. And we have to be really thoughtful on what's the relationship between those two. How do they fit together? It's not a curricular activity, but if we have kids that are serious, active training for a sport, to do something that would maybe overload them in a PE class wouldn't be wise. And so we think about how those two elements can actually go together to pursue a similar end. And I think there's some thoughtfulness needed there. In a similar way, and lower ages, we are not merely using our physical education program to say we want good basketball players or we want good volleyball players. We introduce them to those games because we know that we can, and they might have in other places, opportunities there. And by introducing them earlier, they're introduced, they can begin to develop some skills. But we're not going to compromise on the cultivation of kind of fundamental fitness, movement, joy, to have a better varsity team. And so I think just a really thoughtful approach to how do these two things come together. There might be certain schools, however, that due to geographic location, facilities, may not be able to develop an athletic program. That actually probably changes then the nature of your PE program if you're thinking that these things are working together towards common ends. And so I think it's important to have administration that's thoughtful about this, and then in a really strong relationship between the PE teachers and then athletic director or whoever is kind of overseeing the physical education, so that everything's working together for the cultivation and health of the body, but then also kind of at the end for furthering the mission, full mission of the school.
Nate Neveau is athletic director at Hillsdale Academy here in Hillsdale, Michigan, talking about classical physical education for modern times. Nate, thanks so much for joining us here on the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast.
Thanks, Scott.
I'm Scot Bertram. We invite you to like us on Facebook. Search for Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education. You also can follow us on Instagram at Hillsdale_K-12. That's Hillsdale_K-12 on Instagram. Thank you for listening to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio.